But first thing that we are going to do, though, is I want to go ahead and take a look at what's happening Thursday night. Now, Thursday night was getting this game was getting some consideration to possibly get a college game day appearance. It ultimately didn't happen that game. They're going to North Carolina for South Carolina instead, which that game alone, that is actually going to be a game in which we'll talk about in the next pod. But in this podcast, though, we'll talk about this Florida and Utah game. Now, Florida and Utah did play last year. This was a very tight game. This was a game that Florida found a way to win. Florida did find a way to win this game in the swamp. And what they were able to go ahead and accomplish was a pretty good win. It was a really good win for Florida to start the season. That was their highest quality win that they got throughout the year. But then they weren't able to do much after that. Ended up going 6-7 afterwards. Utah, however, Utah was able to go 10-4. They went to the Pac-12 championship, won the Pac-12, but they lost in the Rose Bowl to Penn State to end the year. So 10-4 was their final record. So right now, this is going to be one of the more competitive. This is actually the most competitive game, the most competitive marquee game that we've had a chance to actually go ahead and preview. Now, that being considered, how does Florida possibly go about pulling this upset off? So the big thing with the Florida Gators. So we'll go to Florida first because they are the underdog, as we always do. Now, for Florida, here's what they'll need to do in order to be successful in this game. And I think for Florida, it starts with that ground game. They need to be able to get things going on the ground. And that's even more critical this year because they don't have as dynamic of a quarterback. Anthony Richardson was the quarterback for Florida last year. And while he's not this prolific passer by any means, he's still very raw in terms of actually being a passer from a quarterback perspective. Anthony Richardson is a once-in-a-generation athlete. He is a once-in-a-generation athlete, and that showed in the Utah game. Utah had a really hard time containing this kid, and AR just made some really spectacular plays. But there's a new quarterback in town, and this quarterback is Graham Mertz. Now, Graham Mertz does have starting experience. He started at Wisconsin for multiple years, but he was never this elite quarterback. Actually, is a very average quarterback by FBS standards. I won't say that he's trash, because starting at a Power 5 program, that's pretty hard to accomplish in its own right in the grand scheme of things, but he is very average. So it's going to be important for Florida to establish a running game against that Utah defensive front. And why that's important is because Florida, they went 6-1 last year when they ran the ball for more than 210 yards. And in the one game that they lost, that was to Florida State, which was ranked in the top 25 at the time. They even gave Florida State a pretty difficult time. Now, if they don't run for that 200 yards mark, Florida's going to be in for a long day. They did not win a single game when they didn't reach that 210 mark. And that being said, that's why I believe that it is extremely important to go and run the football. Now, good news for Florida, we still don't really know the status of Cam Rising. Cam Rising is the centerpiece of that offense out there at Utah. He did tear his ACL in the Rose Bowl against Penn State, unfortunately. So he is questionable for this game, and that's why there's been a little bit of fluctuation on that Vegas line. I've seen it fluctuate from 4.5 to 7 points if you're looking on FanDuel, for example. So that being said, Cam Rising might not play. They will, however, have Brandon Rose, who could possibly play in this game, and he does have a fair amount of experience, at least enough to know what he's doing in terms of running the offense. So for Florida, if they're going to win this game, regardless of if Cam Rising plays or not, they're going to have to rely on their defense. Play complementary football. That means that defense has to step up and make this an ugly game, which is what they did last year. Because even with AR, they didn't score that many points. Or at least I don't remember them scoring that many points. The offensive line also will need to, actually, no, the defensive line will need to go to work as well. Utah offensive line, if they're able to win in the trenches against Florida's front seven, then Florida's going to really struggle. And not only that, it will have a hard time keeping Utah off the field offensively. So Florida, if they can play good complementary football, play sound defense, win in the trenches defensively, and offensively play into that complementary football. You don't have to have all of these explosive plays, but if you can be efficient, move the chains, create some longer drives, and control the clock, then Florida has a real good shot of winning this game. Now, let's go ahead and jump over to that Utah side. Now, Utah, their offense, it could very well. We talked about this already. Cam Rising might not play in this game. We already established this, that there is a real shot that we will not see Cam Rising in this upcoming football game. That is a real possibility. So if Rice, or not Rice, we're not thinking about food here. What about Utah? What's Utah's keys to the game? And it really comes down to a couple of things. Starting strong, Utah was one of the best teams in terms of second quarter scoring. They outscored opponents 204 to 70. Third down conversions, they held for their opponents to 32% on third down conversions last year. And then they themselves, they converted more than half of their third downs. So that's a big thing. So even with Cam Rising does not play in this game, that doesn't mean that Utah won't have an explosive offense this season. They'll still have a pretty good offensive line. And because they have a pretty good offensive line, they'll be able to run the ball pretty well. And again, Bryson Barnes, he's a guy that does have that experience. Not to mention, I think Utah can take advantage of the Florida Gators offensive line as well, because it is a little bit of a patchwork right now. Bill Napier is still trying to build this program from the ground up. Granted, they got a pretty good recruiting class last year, but you need 2 or 3 of those put together in order to be a national power. And Florida's just not there yet at the same time. Another thing is, can the DBs hold up? That was a real concern the past couple of seasons, was the lack of depth in the DB room. Now, do they take that step and help out their front seven? Because a good defense is built from the front to the back. You start by getting pressure, then you build from there. And Utah has a pretty good front seven. Don't get me wrong. But can those DBs hold their own against those SEC caliber receivers? Because Florida has some pretty good receivers on their roster as well. So Graham Mertz will have somebody to throw the ball to. Ricky Purcell, for example, he's a senior. And then they have a pair of running backs, well, Trevor Etienne included, the little brother of the Indy Etienne that is with the Jaguars right now. So, a little bit of a fun fact for you there too. So we'll take a look. We saw the line. The line's at 7 right now. What do I think is going to happen? The any given Saturday power rating model has Utah at a -15. I still think that it will be a close game, so I'm not betting on the line. But I do also think, so if this game is at Utah, that's a big thing in all of this, is that they're going to be in Utah. And Utah is actually a pretty underrated environment. Rice-Earls Stadium, that could be an intimidating place to play at too. I think Florida might be a little bit off guard by that. I think Utah does win this game, but I think at the same time, it is going to be a close game as well, like it was last year. Could possibly go to the final play of the game.